Hey, everybody.
Hello.
Happy Thursday.
Hey, Brandon. Hey, everyone.
Hello.
I tried to get a bunch of the names in there. Hopefully I got everybody so far. Put the meeting minutes here in the chat in case anybody doesn't have that link. At least I think I copied and pasted that. Try that again. There we go. So looks like we've got a good chunk of the regulars, a handful of somewhat new people. And as always, happy to see folks like Amy joining us. And in fact, Amy, I promised you. Yeah, I promised you earlier that I would move you up to the beginning just in case you ever had to run away for something else. So
no, all good, all good. I mean, in large part, basically like, Chris let me know that perhaps we have not done a great job about being able to update the website. And I put a link over into the HackMD about where exactly these actually live. And it turns out we haven't been updating this, like, I don't know, 2021. So there are obviously some releases that need to be able to get updated in there. My first thing was, I think we should probably like update the release checklist, but we should also catch up on backlog. And who would be the right people to be able to go hunt down to be able to catch up on that backlog?
yeah, I think getting an issue opened up in each one of the spec repos to do both of those has to be good as a starting point.
Okay, I can do that.
That's I can do that as well. So those are easy things to knock out.
Okay.
And then, yeah, between actually pulling in the backlog and updating it, I don't think either of those are going to be too difficult. It's just one of those things we need to do.
It's just housekeeping. It's housekeeping that we should be doing.
The other housekeeping I saw today showing up my issue list was apparently all the links are broken on the website.
Huh.
Well, for the runtime spec, apparently.
Oh, okay.
Maybe not all the links, but yeah, everything under runtime spec is apparently broken. So I was saying, oh, that doesn't sound good.
Okay, so my to-do list is basically runtime spec is broken, wonder why. So that is a fixable problem.
It is under interesting specs.opencontainers.org issue number 3. I can drop a link here as well, in case we didn't have enough. And Vanessa's chimed in on that one. She knows more about some of those back-end things than anybody else. So good to see her as well.
Oh, well, this is very recent. Okay, so like it is not bad that I am like behind the 8 ball on this one. Going like, where happened? Okay, it just happened today. Neat. Okay.
No, not at all. It just showed up in my issues. I'm like, oh, how convenient. They're talking about links having issues.
Surprise! Hooray!
Yeah.
Yeah, my other thing that just came up this morning that I didn't have time to be able to put on the HackMD was we can likely get space again at KubeCon in Chicago. But it seems like there was more of a conversation about, rather than just having a meeting, something else, like other ideas of things we should do. And I don't think that we've got all of like the right people in here, and I didn't put it on the agenda. So I think my next steps here are really big. Like, I can start a thread over in the OCI Slack for, if we had space, what would you want to do?
Yeah, a good first step there might be getting a show of hands of people in the Slack, people that are going to be able to make it on site.
Okay.
And that way we can get a feel for then knowing who's going to be there, what do they want to be able to do at that time.
Okay. All right, I am happy to be able to go start that thread in there. I'll probably do it after this meeting. So cool. That is all from me, unless you have like questions, things that I can answer, stuff running around.
Just always happy to have you show up.
Hooray! No, it's like the one time that like I'm not like triple booked today, so good to see you all, and you know where to find me. So I will hand your meeting back to you, Brandon, or run off with it.
All right. Well, I threw all kinds of stuff on the agenda today. I was not shy about adding items into the list. So let me see about moving some windows around and getting maybe some screen sharing up for folks. That might make things easier to follow along at home. And as soon as I do that, all my scroll bars move, but we'll sort that out in a second. screen sharing this window. And I got to keep a couple windows up every time I do this. So there we go. I think I got things organized. So yeah, I think the big question today, and maybe one to get Sajay and who else do we have on here that's been working on some of this? Looks like you might be alone representing this one, Sajay. Talking about the subject on the index.
Yes. So for some context, I think as we had requested, folks started running the conformance test, and then both on the ORAF side and on the ACR side also, I think you saw bin open up a couple of issues on relaxing the content type, but I think they decided to fix it on their side. But long story short, the one issue is that if you have a subject on the artifact type, the image spec doesn't require that as a must as for the artifact type in the index. So what happens is in the distribution spec, when you query the referrers, there is a statement that says, or rather, it says that the artifact type should be present. We covered the cases for the image manifest, which has either using the artifact type from the config or from the manifest itself. But for the index, because there is no config, there's no way to kind of determine if the artifact type is there or not. So I think a couple of options is, I think probably the only option that we're seeing is, should we make artifact type a must if there is a subject, because it is using the new reference API and things like that. So otherwise you can't, the spec is kind of inconsistent across distribution and image right now. I don't know whether I did a good job of summarizing it, but maybe that helps.
Yeah, I was debating, do I try to open a window up and then as I'm moving things around so that I can get to that, all kinds of what happens. But the issue that you're pointing out is in the refers response itself, we say that, hey, we do need to have that artifact type in there.
Yes, in the content discovery section, the list referrers has a para in there that says, yes, exactly, upon success, that section. Yep.
Yeah. So do other people have opinions on this? My knee-jerk reaction is, yeah, conditional requirement makes sense. My biggest concern was, does JSON, the JSON schema stuff, support that? And it looks like Tianon, I think it was Tianon that chimed in and said, yeah, sure does. So I think a PR for that is at least possible.
That will be on the image spec side, right? If there is a subject, ensure that is a artifact type.
In terms of validating the structure itself, it would be good to have that in there. It might be good to try pushing a bad index on distribution in the conformance over there and verify that a registry rejects it as an invalid index. Other people have opinions on that? Oh, we got Sleepy John back. Did we wake you up? Baby duty?
I'm on my phone. That's just what I put in my phone that one time, and I guess it's that I'm watering stuff so I don't die in heat wave. I don't think we can. I don't know if it makes sense to reject that. I don't know. I'm thinking while trying to be outside, which is hard. But like, if a registry doesn't know about the subject field, it's not going to reject it if it has a subject and not an artifact type, and that's fine, right? I think maybe a registry ought not set the OCI subject header on a index that has a subject and not an artifact type. That might be a better thing to test for conformance, because it's like, I don't know. the lack of that says that, okay, the registry doesn't think that this has a subject, but I also don't really love that. I think I'd be happier if it just didn't have an artifact type. But I think I lost that fight a while ago, but maybe ponder that. But if it's okay.
And here I'm the one that was going to be happier if we didn't have the subject, but I lost that fight too. I feel like we're between a bunch of bad options because if we don't reject it, then clients are going to typically do the fallback and they're going to try to manually push it. So we need to tell clients that if you get a bad artifact like this, that you should not do the fallback if you don't have an artifact type.
I guess I also don't see it as a problem with an index in particular, because while an image has like a concrete type of what it is, it's a leaf node in some collection, an index is really more of like a generic abstract data type where like, this is a collection of things. And I don't know that it's a problem for like a list not to have an artifact type. But I'm also, I think I have a different perspective on the semantics behind basically every abstraction in OCI than everyone else. So I might be just totally off the wall.
Another option is that if we relax the requirement of the artifact type as a must in the referrer's response, that would also, I mean, I wasn't sure whether that was an option, but the reason is the artifact type can be null on the image spec, and there is no way to make this empty on the referrer's response. How do we could go either way, like we either make that a must or we make this a should.
Yeah, I'm happier with that option for what it's worth.
Might be the cleanest of all of them.
The reason, maybe I can describe more. The reason was that when we talked through this problem with Billy, it was okay to look at annotations and other things and then define what the client needs to do with it. The artifact type is one option, but I like John's statement that you could have multiple things in there. So maybe defining an artifact type might be a burden, but and the referrer's response does not need that, but it can use the annotations or even look at the manifest if it wants to. So I'm okay if we can make this a should. That's also fine.
Is there any option to filter when you have the artifact type undefined?
No, that wouldn't be possible. We'll have to extend the annotation filtering mechanism and things like that. So maybe we call it out, like if it's not there in the filters, it won't come.
That's what I would expect. I think if you're not filtering on artifact type, then you would get this in the response. But if you are filtering on a specific artifact type, then it would not be present.
Yeah, I guess where I was going was, is there going to be a filter for empty artifact type or something? But I like the idea of saying you're already making something that's kind of bad, so let's just not support it any other way.
The infamous question, right? Do we want strongly typed or not?
Okay, sounds like we've at least got a direction to go. Do we know it? Do we have volunteers for who wants to open a PR up for that?
Just to check, so we're going to do a PR on distribution to make the list referrers as a should, right?
Correct.
I'm out next week. Otherwise, I wouldn't mind doing it. But also given this, I also believe that at this point, without this PR, the spec is kind of inconsistent. So releasing it would be a problem. So are you okay if we block on the release till this issue is sorted out?
Oh, I already was going to block the release, so I think you're good there.
Now just make it formal and state why I'm not doing it, right?
I had other reasons to block on it, but yeah, there's one more in there.
So this was the only item that I heard from Bin, who's kind of owning ACR at this point, to block on because they ran the conformance test internally and they're making a bunch of fixes. But they haven't finished it out, so they'll probably respond on that issue.
Sounds good.
Along this decision point, since we're trying not to make architectural decisions in this call, should we pop up an email or get, make sure everybody that might have a...
Yes, I'll follow up on that with at least this is the one item that I have on my list to hold off because I committed to creating the vote. I'll update the issue as well as send out an email.
Cool, thanks.
I think the main thing is it's an issue in the repo. We'll have a pull request on there for people to see.
Already
Those are
there.
the two things I'm.
Yep. Great.
All right, good with that one. Should close out some tabs because my browser is having a difficult time with all these things open. We've got the next issue here. Make sure I go to the right one. Of the content type header. And I think this was also coming from ACR looking at this stuff. The question was along the lines of we're requiring when you have the refurbished response that it says that this is an application type image.index v1 JSON, which that seems like that's what we want. The problem is that some people are outputting with a parameter in there. And I suspect you're going back and changing and taking the parameter out of the content type header. But this also goes back to issue 408, where I was asking, do we want to support the parameters on the content type header? I don't have a hard feeling on here. I am just kind of worried about a lot of systems out there that are expecting it to not have parameters and how many things we're going to break if we start to allow them.
What does the HTTP spec say about this?
So the HTTP spec says for content type, you're allowed to have a parameter. And what our spec says is the content type will be a specific value. We don't necessarily say that there is a parameter in there. Where it gets ambiguous is when we say that you must have this media type as your content type in our spec. Are we implying that the parameter must be null? Or are we implying that we're only talking about this one field and that the rest of it can be freeform?
I mean, we can clarify that, but I think the HTTP spec always takes precedence over what we say there. And if there's any confusion, I think we should defer to the HTTP spec.
Are people getting utility out of parameterized content types, or is this just like something that's being added by web frameworks and middle boxes?
I suspect the latter. Especially because we have a definition in the spec that says everything must be UTF-8 if it's text. But yeah, the area where I'd try to understand and sort out the complication is we can still say that we are 100% following the HTTP spec and not allow parameters because we said the content type must be this exact field and we're including parameters in that definition.
I I guess speaking from like the Docker engine side, so I don't know if y'all remember or if y'all noticed the Go 1.20.6 fun, but I would suggest cleaving as close to the HTTP spec as possible. So if HTTP says that parameters are allowed, yeah, I'll allow them and decide. I mean, maybe they're ignored or not, and they should certainly be called out to reduce ambiguity in the spec. But I mean, we just went through this saga of Go let us stick a what is technically invalid by the HTTP spec as a parameter in the host header, which we relied on. And then when Go changed that because of a security release, the entire ecosystem broke somewhat spectacularly. And the Go authors weren't looking at what people are doing in Go. They were looking at the HTTP spec and using that to reason about what was safe and not safe to make as a change in the standard library. Given that the HTTP spec is kind of always canonical, I would suggest just assuming that people will make similar assumptions, that the HTTP spec will always be the final authority on what the header can contain, and that has to be acknowledged.
Okay, so when we say that the content type must contain this specific value, that specific value that we're talking about is only the media type base field and not any other parameters in there. And so we need to clarify that in the spec if that's what we're saying. We need to clarify that in our spec. That is one thing I want to point out from this, is that all of us are saying spec, and we've got distribution spec, HTTP spec, and it gets confusing and we don't specify which.
Maybe I'm reading this wrong, but if the IANA type is registered, all parameters of that IANA type should be defined as possible parameters. So technically speaking, we have not registered that as an acceptable parameter for the index v1 JSON. The spec says that you can have parameters as a definition of your media type, but when you register your media type, those have to be also defined. So it depends on how you want to think about it also, is what I'm understanding. So correct me if I'm wrong. Those types have to be at least predefined as what's acceptable, because you cannot extend functionality with another car set on that, which is not defined.
I mean, I don't think you need to impose validations necessarily on the registry. The registry can decide to validate or not according to whatever HTTP library it uses. I think it's probably sufficient just to say that, as specified in the RFC, parameters are accepted.
Or in this case, since we're defining a subtype, whether they're defined on the subtype, it seems to say that if it's defined on the subtype, then we basically inherit those. I'm not sure if what we have there is defined as like a subtype, though.
I'm not getting a solid answer out of this. Am I missing it, or are we all a little wishy-washy? I saw you come.
I mean,
off
I
mute,
guess
but I'm not
the
hearing
the
Sorry, go
question
ahead.
is whether a registry might ever interpret a parameter, whether it could have any meaning to a registry. And I guess the argument there is, since we're only dealing with JSON and modern JSON is defined strictly in terms of UTF-8, functionally, there's no point. I mean, there are other parameters other than char set, but theoretically, but from a practical standpoint, there aren't really.
The fear I have if we allow this is, I know a lot of places in code, client registry server and whatnot, they're looking at, for example, the content type for a manifest that it's receiving, and they will run it through a case statement to say, Is this an OCI index? Is this an OCI image manifest? Is this a Docker V2 schema for an image? And those case statements don't have an initial step before that when they're parsing the content type header to strip out the parameters. And they are explicit string matches. And that code is in a lot of places.
I don't think we should add explicit support for it. It's just more, does the spec require us to support it?
And the RFC does say that protocols may choose to restrict parameters.
All right. So I'm hearing people say that as long as we can get away with it, we should say no. But if maybe it still makes sense to throw some language in there that says, hey, if you want to be a good client, handle that in case you see it. But if you don't handle it, we're saying that it should never happen. And we'll throw that in the conformance test too, that it shouldn't happen.
I mean, it sounds like another guidance case where best practice probably is to allow it and yeah, not do an absolute string match, but to do a substring match or prefix match. But at the same time, conforming registries should not, but there's always the chance that, you know, clients should degrade gracefully.
And I might completely disagree with what you were just saying there.
I think you typed what I just said.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I've just registries should not do this. Clients shouldn't see it, but it doesn't cost them much to be resilient to it if it happens.
Yeah. I've had to do this with other stuff. I don't think we ever really defined very well the tag response. And so registries and the tag response often throw a parameter in there sometimes. Good times when they do that and you weren't expecting it. Well, anything else before I jump to the next one? Like I say, I told you all, I filled this whole meeting up. This one, we've kind of gone back and forth a little bit. I'd love to see us come to an agreement on. And the one that I'm most interested in is OCI refers with an absent header. Present doesn't matter to me as much. And there was also a suggestion to have a full artifact type list there to give more details. This is an efficiency. So if it's not there, it doesn't break anything. But if it is there, this allows clients to skip API calls that it doesn't need to run. And so for anybody that hadn't had a chance to read this, what we're saying is when you go to fetch a manifest, the registry can give you a header on that response that says, oh, by the way, there are, or in this case, there are not refers to that manifest. And having the registry explicitly tell you this manifest you pulled does not have a refer that points to it can save you a later call of going back and checking that after the fact. Go ahead, John.
This is interesting. I haven't read this issue, so I'm probably going to say things that are already discussed, but it imposes a little bit of burden on the registry on the pull path. That can probably be cached, but it would be nice to use this header to say, like, here's the URL you can go to actually for the refers as well. Instead of just like a Boolean, this could be like a redirect essentially. It says, hey, yeah, there are refers, they are here. And that gives us maybe a little bit of flexibility in the future. If we want to change
I'm-
things up.
I'm going to jump ahead of Sajay because he was pitching this one last time. In the positive case, when there is a refer, it's not as useful because we know the refers API. We've got the query that we're supposed to run to get that. And the usefulness of this one is when you don't see that header, but you need something in there that tells you explicitly, not only do I not have this header saying, here's where you could get it, but don't even try to get it, because trying to get it, you're going to come back with a null response. And so having the absence of the header doesn't tell you anything. It's the positive header in there that says it's absent and tells you something. To put that in context, if we query an OCI 1.0 registry a day, none of them are going to have the header. But you can't make an assumption on that. You still need to query and see if the refers API is there. You then need to fall back and use the tag API to see it. This gives you something of saying, hey, I support the refers API and that content isn't there. Skip all the rest of your processing you're about to do.
I could see there being a sentinel value in the link header that's like, this does not exist.
That's kind of what I was going for. So I think I left the comment in there, hoping that we could use the link header, but is there a spec in the link header that would enable something like that?
I just saw your comment. Wow, cool. We had the same thought. Great.
Do you mean, is there in the link header format, is there a standard way to say something does not exist, to express a negative? Because the link header is always in terms of, like, you could have a sentinel value, you could have a link with a made up URL that signifies that nothing's present, but the format of the link header always requires there to be, well, not a URL, a URI.
And I know I've seen comments down here saying some registries, and Docker Hub being a big one out there, so I definitely get it. Some registries are not going to implement this. Because it's an efficiency gain, I'm not too worried about that. It's, to me, it is if the registry implements this, I can cut out a lot of API calls. So I could see this as being a should. If that turns into a may in practice, that's okay too.
We could abuse the no follow relationship to indicate that you shouldn't.
Yes. So the relation type is exactly where I was going with, but that's defined in some obscure version of the it's attached to some type, right? So it might be okay to use it.
Are we being good HTTP citizens if we try to
No.
abuse the link header?
Relation types are defined in the web specification, I think so.
Like, no follow is not part of HTTP,
Right.
as far as I'm aware. It's part of like some W3C DOM standard, and you're allowed to use those same relations that are defined in the DOM in the link header, because the link header is meant to have the same semantic meaning as a literal link element in the HTML body.
The no follow keyword indicates that the link is not endorsed by the original author or publisher of the page, or that the link to the reference document was included primarily because of a commercial relationship between people affiliated with the two pages. Wild. I think we could squeeze in there. Why not?
I mean, I think if I remember right, no follow was meant as like a Google bot. Don't don't crawl this, don't follow this link.
Which is what we want, right? We want the client not to follow it, but we want to indicate that it does exist. We would serve you a valid response, but don't follow that because there's nothing there. Maybe this is a terrible idea. I'm sure someone with more opinions would convince me otherwise, but it seems okay. I don't know.
I can imagine someone would want to set no follow on all the refers APIs to avoid a bot traversing this, hitting all the refers for every manifest if they had some kind of web interface.
I mean, you would use like robots.txt, right? For that kind of thing. Not that sure.
I mean, there's robots.txt is defined with semantics of like, does it make sense for something which is calling registry content to respect robots.txt when robots.txt primarily relates to web content and not some other thing that happens to be served over HTTP? Like, I don't think there are things that crawl registries that exist today, and I don't think any of them respect robots.txt, nor does it necessarily make sense to expect them to.
And that I wouldn't expect them to respect no follow unless they're actually clients that we care to serve, right?
Right, but I think that's going back to what Brandon was saying, is that some people might want to set no follow just because they don't want, what's the name of the thing I'm trying to think of right now? Scarf. Like Scarf Gateway crawls registries today, and maybe you want to set no follow to tell them not to crawl things, but like I think the Brandon statement is that the meaning of that might quickly become overloaded.
Yeah, someone might want to use no follow for the original purpose of no follow.
I mean, if you're introducing a new header like artifact types, is it conceivable that we could introduce a new relation type like not present or absent or things like that? The reason why I was even interested in the link header is you could potentially say, go to this other place to find the referrers, which gives you more flexibility than just saying a present or an absent and inventing yet another header for like redirection. So anyway, that's the other point that was interesting.
I'm trying to understand the value of a link header of where you want to go, because does that imply that if someone's not checking out link header, that they might pull up different refers than someone that pulled the whole manifest? Because they might hit different APIs. It feels dangerous to me.
So if you had a link header that was just a link, I think that would just be expressing you can find the referrers at this link. But right. If the referrers API supported, you already know what endpoint to hit to find the referrers. It's really just a case of, I guess you support the referrers API and I don't need to fall back to the tag schema, right? So I think really where the value is expressing a negative so that you know, I don't have to hit the referrers API at all because this content knows that there's nothing pointing to it. Like, I think that's really what that issue is really about, is the negative case. The positive case doesn't add a lot, but the negative case means that, I can completely skip querying this endpoint because I know that there will be nothing there.
I think we had punted a use case where they wanted to store SBOMs in another repository or another place, which would enable you to ask the manifest, where are your SBOMs stored? And it need not even be in the same repository. I know, and I'm probably extrapolating a little bit, but the reason for probably coalescing around that one header would be future expansion if you wanted to. But if we introduce one header for present or absent, okay, I think I'd go either way. Maybe I'd step back.
So that does go back to the case where you might have refers in a different location than the refers API, which that worries me.
I think that's good, right? Like one of the arguments against me when I was complaining about embedding annotations is that it's expensive on the back end. And the argument was, well, you can just cache that and serve that. And if someone implements refers in that way, then you could save a whole round trip by having this link send you to the cached blob store directly instead of having to come back through the API and then get redirected out. So I would like this for that reason.
So if you gave one of those links, what you're saying is you would provide in there maybe the refers API plus some kind of cache reference in there.
Well, instead of like slash what v2 whatever, it would be my blobstore.example.com/refers/this key, and that happens to be the refers API response that I generated for that object at the time.
If someone queried the refers API directly, would they get a redirect to that same URL?
Yeah.
Yeah, potentially. It's basically like a
Okay.
blob URL at that point with the embedded SAS or anything like that.
Okay.
So if then you support it with the HTTP 300 series response, then it seems like a binary. Like I guess if you had the link in the header, it would save you querying the refers API on the registry just to get redirected to the second registry that has the content.
Right.
But you could still support the use case even if it was a Boolean response: refers yes, refers no, and then 301 if the content lives, if the princess is in another castle.
Right. That I think my aversion to this being a Boolean is just that whenever I've made something a Boolean, I regretted it in basically any context in my life. And overloading a bunch of semantics onto this, if we're gonna make it, if we're gonna do the work to have this Boolean, it would be nice to have more than just a Boolean.
But it's a string. It's not just a yes or no. So it can be true, false, or found, not found. You can make a triplicate. I don't know if you know where that joke comes from.
Yeah, sure.
It's not a dichotomy of link header versus custom header, I guess. But I guess I just have an aversion to the link header because you'd have to come up with a magic sentinel value to express a negative. You'd have to have like some sort of like opencontainers.org/no referrers or something. I don't think just
right.
So you put a link to where to the refers endpoint and you say no follow to say that like this is where you could find refers if there were any, but there aren't.
That was, yeah, I think it's kind of punning on it, but maybe it's stupid. There's also,
I think
there's
it's just
no referrer, but
it's
the semantics are wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think like having that, it seems simple, but I think it's the kind of thing where there's kind of an ambiguity, and over time implementers are going to get confused by it.
Yeah, I'm not 100% convinced on this, but I do like the idea of having it either some header, something that is, oh yeah, here, go here. I know that there's something useful here.
You have a hint so clients can optimize their API calls.
Yeah. Maybe prematurely optimizing this whole thing, but be nice.
I would be perfectly open to saying add OCI refers with an absent header and then also adding a link header if you did have it. Two different ways to get the information, but slightly different kinds of information.
That seems okay.
Because I guess the virtue of adding the link would just be that you could save the API call if the referred content is on another registry. You could save the 301 by just directly knowing where to go.
I feel like we're making progress today. So the direction we're going to go is support the absent. And also add a link header. So that kind of follow along the direction we're going. And both of these are optional performance improvements. If clients don't support the link header, they're still going to work going back. If clients don't support the absent header, they'll just hit the API again. If registries don't support the absent header, they will just hit the API again.
I mean, I think what you're saying is support two forms of hinting. One is where the actual referrers are, and the other one is referrers are or not present. So instead of trying to overload it into a single thing, support both types of hints.
Yeah. So don't overload the link header. Use the link header just for links, and the absent header will just be its own thing. Cool.
my hope is that we don't require it to be present, right? It's just the absent header is all we need.
For clients, you can do everything the way you're doing today and be just fine. You can improve your performance by checking the absent header and skipping an entire API call. And you can further improve it by supporting the link header if you see it.
Sounds good. The only thing is that the value of present, is that required?
I would not do the present header.
Okay, cool.
I would just do the absent header. And then the true false file not found Boolean would be if the link header is there, that's the equivalent of not absent. But that's the registry explicitly saying it. And you need the registry to explicitly say it because registries will not implement either of these in some cases. Yeah, if you do both, I think the clients just say this registry is screwed up. Maybe we can put that as part of a conformance test to make sure no one's actually trying to do both. Always a good question because someone will find a way to break it. This one's been sitting in my backlog for a little bit. It was something I thought would be nice to clean up before we do a release, which is we've got a couple references. I don't think Rocket is the only thing, but it was the one that caught my biggest attention, which is that it's an archive project and we have that linked in some of our documentation that says, hey, here's an example implementation of this. Do we want to create a emeritus status, something like that, that says here's former projects or archive projects and move them out from being in the top level list? I'm going to take that as nobody wants to solve that before a 1.1 release.
Yeah, no comment on that one, but it doesn't seem that necessary, but to have such a status.
It gets back to us having old documentation in places.
Well, I mean,
got
the
that everywhere.
emeritus status doesn't seem too valuable.
I think the other option was just call it archive. So indicate that, hey, here is something we don't necessarily have to completely kick you out, but nobody's maintaining the project anymore. It's not being used. We shouldn't throw that on our top level list. If we were making the spec today, they wouldn't be on the page. Okay. So this last one, I don't know if I got this last one. This may be somebody else.
I added that. Jordan and I were having a discussion around some conformance issues with the hub related to it, and it's not an issue that the hub's necessarily going to change here. It makes more sense to kind of discuss. We kind of went back and looked at the original decision point of why this became a must, and kind of wanted to discuss that a little bit about changing that. It makes more sense essentially to change that to a may, since it's really only for a potential client's optimization, not necessarily something that needs to be required by the registries. And in some cases, some registries will just not support that at all.
I feel like saying the only client, but
well, the main thing there is, yeah, on the server side, having those strong relationships, like down to the data model, like registries may have that sort of strong relationship that's required, and basically saying that it's a requirement that registries don't have that data model in order to implement 1.1 is a little too strong of language there, especially since it's, at least my understanding is trying to go back and understand the original feature, but it seems the original feature is around supporting registries that are referrers that don't necessarily have to have the manifest to them. So we talked about earlier about like an SPOM registry or something that doesn't have the original content.
So that was one reason. The other reason that I have and that I've implemented and I think has given headaches to a lot of people because of the way I'm playing it. But I threw in the conformance test, so I win. That's a joke. I do the copy of all of the artifacts first before I push the manifest. And the logic is that when the manifest appears on the remote registry server, all the metadata for that manifest is also there. And so once that label is there, you'll never pull an unsigned image. You'll never have an image over there that doesn't have an SBOM if that SBOM was available when we were copying it. There's not that race condition in the middle where someone sees a new tag appear and then later on the metadata appears. So that was the method to that madness.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense from a client standpoint, and especially I get the idea of like not trying to fall back. I mean, the problem is just that, I mean, this is something that can't move for Hub, is the discovery that I made recently, talking to the folks who work on this, is that at the scale Hub operates at, to allow this means that the refers API would have to have pathologically slow queries. It's simply with the current data model. Well, I shouldn't even say with the current data model. With the scale Hub operates at, it's too slow to allow dangling references and to have to resolve them on the fly versus ensuring that they exist at upload. And it seems like this was changed to make life slightly easier for clients, right? Because like there's two things. One, as a client, I can upload the content, then upload the referrers, then check that everything is there and exit 1, exit 0 to confirm that everything was successful. And then there is like the talk to issue of, there is technically a race window in there of a couple seconds when the content is uploaded and everything's good there, but the referrers aren't uploaded yet, where yeah, the signatures could be missing. But it seems like that is potentially, to me at least, it seems like that's potentially scope for future work, where, for example, there could be a multi-component upload, transactional upload API, where when you take out a transaction, nothing is live in the database until the transaction is completed, to allow for that kind of use case. It's just that the must language here makes scaling large registries very difficult, depending on how you architect your database.
Is that made any easier by the fact that if someone queries one of these before the manifest is uploaded, so not the deal with the subject, but the actual referred to manifest, you can give a referrer's response that says nothing there.
Right, but you still have to check the database, right? Like if the concept of a dangling symlink is allowed at all, that means that you have to check the database to check if the refer is really there or not to give that response. Whereas if you enforce the validation at upload time, that means that you can just, for example, in the case of a relational database, you could have a foreign key relationship to make that query much faster.
It makes uploading signatures first impossible if you do it that way.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't make it impossible. It means that not all registries have to support that. If we change this to a may, your client will have to detect whether it can upload signatures first or not and fall back, which admittedly is a burden on the client, but I think the burden on the client is lesser than the burden on the registry.
The scenario was that the client does not push the image manifest before it pushes the signature.
So even in that scenario, though, like it's trying, like supporting that is nice, but the registry is not required to support that flow. Like it doesn't get around some of the issues around like signature freshness and like making sure that content, like the right signatures actually exist. Like that should be more pushed to like the notary side or, the validator side in terms of like whether or not, you've hit some strange case where I pulled something and there's no signature to it versus like how that actual upload flow must go. Because even that requirement, we still have like eventually consistent stuff in the back end. Like you may end up with cases where you have to retry operations. But
so what you're saying is that it's up to the client to handle the fact that referrers may or may not exist at that point. And
I mean, it goes back to the same thing where referrers not existing isn't always like the right signal. Like we talked about having that absent header. Maybe that absent header doesn't make sense for a registry that doesn't actually know for certain how, if it's not consistent in the back end yet, or it's on the storage.
And I think the signatures first, like there's a little bit of XY problem here because yes, like that means that a client can't unconditionally push signatures first, but why is it trying to do that? I think there are two reasons. One is to ensure that errors are reported if you have trouble pushing signatures before the content's pushed, to avoid a state where like I've pushed the content, but I failed to push the signatures and I didn't report that correctly. So that does mean that the client will have to check at the end that, everything it pushed is like it thinks it is. If it wants to affirmatively give that signal, that is a bit more burden on the client, but I think ultimately that's not unfair for, a so-called like atomic upload to verify things after the fact, given how the API is designed today. Versus the burden on registry implementers if essentially their database model is prescribed to them. And then the other thing it prevents is the time of check, time of use, or the race condition issue, which, there's not really a way around that outside of uploading signatures first today. But I guess I would argue, again, given the burden on registries, it's better to design a transactional upload API so that you can upload everything in one go and not have anything partially live than it is to try to work around the need for a transactional upload method by allowing for dangling references to exist. Because at least if you have a transactional upload API, you can validate that any so-called dangling references will be concrete, will be resolvable once the entire transaction is committed before you accept it.
Yeah, I saw that comment. I was going to mention the push by digest as well. Like that was similar for multi-platform images. Like previously, the approach was just push everything up to a specific tag and then tag everything, then retag it at the end. I don't know if you remember that issue for like official images for a while, but like if you pulled at the wrong time, you would get the wrong image. But I think push by digest solve some of those. Like if that's something that the client wants to strongly enforce, that once a tag has been updated, everything is there. You can already solve that today with push by digest. Or push by like an unsigned tag and then push by a signed tag once basically you're confident all the referrers are there.
You made a comment about like a whole transactional workflow for pushing this num. Is that more than just push by digest and then push the tag after the fact? Do you have a thought process of what that would look like?
That's effectively transactional for tags. It's not unlike the Unix create temp file, unlink, rename workflow, which like, can one argue that like a higher level transactional API could be good? Yeah, but you can work around today. It's just, it goes back to that burden on clients. And I guess my theory of the burden on clients, it's there, but it's less significant. If you want to have this sort of atomic right to the registry, it's still less burdensome to say that a client has to do that if it wants these guarantees to be true versus forcing large registries to confront the database performance issues or architectural issues that a strong mandate imposes on them.
Yeah. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I know we're running over right now, but I think it's still something worth chatting about. Should we take this over into the Slack or into an issue somewhere?
Yeah, we can file an issue for it.
I really love the transactional API idea. It would definitely solve so many issues if you want to relax this, or I'm okay either way. It just wanted to kind of call out the scenarios that made this a must rather than push back on it.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Like Derek and I can create a follow-up issue. And, I guess the core of this is just that like it's tempting to try to solve some issues by saying must here for the client, but it imposes burdens on the registry. And so it's probably better to enumerate all the pros and cons of each and then decide, okay, so like a transactional API, or there should be guidance on a digest first flow for clients as a alternative to solve some of the same issues, as well as, listing out what we aren't solving and what will have to be future work that people want to solve.
The risk if we say should is that clients can assume that that behavior is going to exist. So clients will fall back to always pushing refers after the fact. And so you can't have a registry server that would ever say every image in this repository must be signed before I make it available. It's just something you couldn't put in code because the spec itself makes all clients implement the exact opposite way.
Well, the client could optimistically try signatures first and then fall back. And a registry certainly could enforce that. Where it gets trickier is whether the client knowing how the registry communicating its behavior to the client, I guess, ahead of time is the difficult thing there.
Yeah.
Or
Let's
the guarantees that the client wants to make. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's follow this up Slack in an issue and see where we go from there. But good issue to pull up.
What was
Thanks,
your
everybody.
blocker, Brandon? You mentioned
Oh.
at the beginning.
Oh, all of them. Mainly
okay.
we've made a lot of changes since the last RC. We don't have an RC that has everything we put in there. And I'm seeing issues pop up lately from people that are trying to implement this. And my biggest concern back in the day was saying, we've put the conformance test out there, we've generated them. And the same person, he's here, Rob, the same person that wrote most of our conformance test also wrote the registry that we were running the conformance test against and the only registry that we were testing against. And so I really wanted someone else to run some examples in there, and I wanted to see some of that.
Cool. Yeah, I think we're all in agreement that the performance test should pass, or we should at least figure out why they're not passing for big registries. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to
Well,
see that
and it's
before we
not
push an
great.
RC.
It's not great to have to run them out of main either. Like ideally what's getting finalized is an RC that's being ratified and not a snapshot of whatever is in main untagged.
Yeah. So getting that feedback from registries and then getting another RC out there for one last final check. Those are my two big things. Cool. Thanks, everybody. Been a super productive meeting. Till next week.